Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to the Council-led Housing Forum. Today's session is on commercial skills. Council-led Housing Forum, if you've not joined us before, a big welcome. And the Council-led Housing Forum was set up to support the London boroughs building new council homes and is hosted by Future of London. My name's Visika Sri Chandrasekhar and I'm the Council-led Housing Forum Manager for Future of London. And Future of London, if you've not come across us before, we're a not-for-profit. We were set up by the London boroughs and all of our activity is around the built environment. And we support boroughs through knowledge, leadership and also networking. And none of this would be possible without our sponsors. So for the Council-led Housing Forum, we have three sponsors who are with us today, and they are Red Loft, BPTW and Potter Raper. And you'll be meeting some of them later because they're helping us out. So I'm going to take us into the agenda. So it's like an agenda really in three parts. We have a main presentation and then we have a short break and then we go into case studies and then you get a longer break. This is the proper tea break. And then we come back for workshops and there'll be time woven throughout that to take Q&A as well, which is really important. We want this to be as interactive as possible. And all of your questions are really, really welcome. My next slide is to introduce Danny Sutcliffe. He's a partner, founding partner at Red Loft Consultancy, one of our sponsors. And Danny has been involved in development. He has a lot of experience. I'm not too sure how many years, maybe Danny will tell us. So I'm going to invite Danny to to take over and introduce yourself and your presentation.
Hi, thank you, Visika. How many years? I don't know, 30, something like that. So quite a few. And today I was just going to rattle through a few ideas which I think make it different for private companies to local authorities in the context of what commercial means and the drivers that impact local authorities. And they are much more complex than those for private companies delivering housing. So if I can have the first slide. Right, so deciding what commercial means to you. And I think that's very important because there are a number of different drivers which we'll go through in a minute. So first of all, I thought I'd start with a definition. So what's the definition of commercial? Intended to make money, means involving or relating to the buying and selling of goods. So pretty straightforward. When we're talking about being commercial, we're talking about delivering a profit in effect. Now, you might call that a surplus, you might call that cross subsidy, but they all end up meaning the same thing. Next slide. So just want to have a quick think about different definitions of commercial for different types of organisation, first of all. So yeah, private sector, you're looking to maximise profit. And I just want to add there, that's not at the expense of everything. I think lots of people think, oh, you're just about making money. Lots of companies want to deliver a really good service or a really good product and make money. And the two are compatible. Housing associations have a cross-subsidy model. And that's something that the central government has imposed upon them. Housing associations used to just build for rent and a bit of shared ownership. And a cross-subsidy model has been imposed upon them to stretch the grant, because grant now does not cover the cost differential between building a home and what the mortgage you can raise to sustain the rents. So there needs to be money from somewhere else. And then when we're looking at local authorities, public sector, you have a number of other drivers as well, value for money and delivering of other services and objectives. And we'll touch on those now. Next slide, please. So when you're delivering housing within a local authority context, there are loads of different drivers which are going to affect what you think is or isn't commercial. And I think one of the biggest ones is costs elsewhere, costs that impact your bottom line as an organisation. So you're a housing department or a regeneration team or a regeneration department, but there are, you have a wider context, you sit within a wider context. And one of the biggest issues that we face today is bed and breakfast and people living in bed and breakfast. Not only is it, incredibly costly, it's socially incredibly costly and divisive as well. And though a lot of that bed and breakfast bill might be taken up with housing benefit, not all of it is, and it's a massive drain on resources for local authorities. So when you're looking at delivering more homes, you're looking at within that context. And so it's appropriate and commercial to think about that and the impacts that what you're doing will have on that bed and breakfast bill. And that can take the form of looking at, say, for example, delivering larger homes. What we've seen is the market doesn't provide 4 and 5 bed homes. And that's the private sector market, and the affordable housing market isn't providing enough of those. So it may be that you need to produce more of those. Now, each borough will have different needs and requirements. It might be that your borough needs lots of 4 or 5 beds or 6 beds, and they're not being provided. And so people who need that accommodation have a disproportionate weight for a new home. So being commercial may be building a 4 or 5 bed home, which is financially not very advantageous through the current grant regime, but may save you long term in your bed and breakfast costs. There are also lots of other different impacts on local authorities. And so, they've got some icons here that are setting those out, but those are, social value, there's social care as well, public political ambitions. So you will be impacted by your elected representatives, and that's as it should be. They've gone to the polls, they've been voted in, they have a mandate through that. So that's another element within that. You have a commitment which other people don't to local jobs and local economy. You want to see your boroughs doing well. So that's another important factor. You have the green agenda, which everybody has, but that's baked into what you do. And then, of course, you're looking to provide cross-subsidy and surpluses or profit. So there are a number of other drivers there that make what you're doing much more complex, and the pulls on what is commercial different. Next slide, please. So I started with a picture of the award-winning, Sterling Prize-winning scheme up in Norwich, which is Goldsmith Street, which looks fantastic and won lots of plaudits. And, it's doing all the things that every scheme would want to do, which is quality design, it's sustainable. I think it's almost 100% carbon neutral. All of it is social rent. There's some larger homes there. I've got to look, so there's no cross subsidy coming out of this, but there are obviously social value and outcomes. But the reason I put this up is I just wanted to think about, this is 100% social rent. Now, and that's like, there's roughly here 100 homes. Now, if they'd have done 80 for social rent and 20 for sale, or if we did that in London, because I know London better than I know Norwich, you could have made something, they could have made something like, or we could make something like 10 million extra. Now that 10 million in terms of subsidy would produce 40 homes. So we build 100 homes here, 80 for rent, 20 for sale. We then got subsidy pot for another 40 homes. So this scheme generates 120 homes, not just 100 homes. Now that might not be what you want to do, or it might be what you want to do, but I think it's worth thinking about. There are always alternatives to what you're doing. So I think it's important that, and I'll touch on that, that there are options when delivering affordable housing, and at what levels the rents are set and what the objectives are of all those schemes. But, the outcome of this is a very, very beautiful place to live. Next slide, please. And so that's looking at different options is about looking at commercial at strategic level is about clarity of purpose, about understanding what you're wanting to do. And I've got a couple of boxes here which set out that there's 170,000 people are homeless in London, and we spend 900 million per year on temporary accommodation. Now these figures are just huge. 900 million. How do I, what does that look like? That's just under $1 billion. It's just a huge amount of money being spent every year on temporary accommodation. And that's not producing any new homes. That's just going to private landlords and other organisations. So we need to have clarity of purpose and really think through what we want to be achieving when we're looking at a strategic level. And the commercial drive is bigger than just the costs involved in that scheme. So I think it's really important that we look at a scheme, we run the models, we understand what the parameters are, what could go wrong, because what can go wrong in development tends to go wrong. So I know we're all kind of over optimistic, but put more fat into those programs and be clear that things are going to take longer than you think. I always think in terms of programs up front, double them. There's a huge amount of tenant consultation and community stakeholder consultation that you're going to go through, which lots of other organizations do not need to do in the same extent. So you need to have a bigger program for that, because talking to people and getting consensus takes time. I think most of the time it's always achieved. Most of the time it's achievable, not always, but most of the time it's achievable, because most of the time your objectives are reasonable and you're looking to provide more housing. But you need to explain that and go through that, and that will take time. So you also need to look at the resources it's going to take, particularly when you're looking at strategic level. If you've not delivered a large program before, you need to get some people in who have done that before and take their advice and listen to people. Because delivering a large program is not the same as delivering a small program. It ratchets up, the problems that you face ratchet up, and the control mechanisms that you need are far greater. So there are economies of scale to a big program, but they need to be managed properly, and you need to be aware of that, and you need to invest. So the commercial element there is investing in that backroom staff that manage those programs. And if you're trying to do it on a shoestring, stuff will go wrong. And if stuff goes wrong, the implications for your programs are massive, because the sums you are dealing with are massive. So not having a program manager who's going to cost you 50 or 60,000 pounds can lead to millions of pounds being wasted on the capital side because you've got stuff wrong. And it's those commercial decisions that need to be made. Next slide, please. So operational level, it's how does that being commercial translate? And I think it's very much around risk and reward. And that's one of the key things, I think, for being commercial. The benefits that you receive from the risks that you take and the cost of those need to be worth the level of risk. And so you need to quantify that risk. You need to be clear what that risk is, and therefore then what that reward is. So you need to have clear analysis of risk. And that's about better decision making. That's about knowing your costs, knowing your program, being very clear what all those drivers are. And that's that cost, program, and value and quality. So knowing that square, and that's incredibly important. And it's about knowing what your exit strategies are as well. Because like I said earlier, stuff goes wrong, and you need to know you have got those exit strategies, because then you can be confident about the decisions you're making. And I think, so at an operational level, it's having a really good grasp of the detail. And so as project managers, you should always know what your contract sum is, what your spend is, what your program is, what your return is likely to be. So what margins are you operating at? And when it moves from those, knowing what you can do to get that back and operating in that commercial way. Next slide, please. So I was asked to say what skills are needed. And I think one of the key things is always thinking about what is the bottom line and how will it be affected by this. Once you're in contract and once you're running it, or even before that, just looking all the time about what that bottom line is, what that bottom line is. You've set out all your objectives. You know what you're wanting to do. We're now just delivering the program. We're delivering the homes. So what's the bottom line? How's that affect? How is what I'm doing affecting that? And the best thing you can do with that for being commercial, I think, is challenge, is keep asking the why question. Why am I doing this? Why has the architect designed this scheme? Why have we got this space here? Why have we got that there? Ask the questions, challenge all the time. There's nothing wrong with asking questions. One of the most effective development people I ever worked with was someone I was doing an MA with at the South Bank. And it was infuriating to be in a course with, because she just asked so many questions. Sometimes I knew the answers to them, sometimes I didn't, but she just asked so many questions. But she was just constantly building up her understanding and her knowledge. And she was fantastic. She was one of the best people in development I've ever worked with, because she always asked the question. And she wasn't afraid of asking what seemed like stupid questions, because she was pushing for the right answers. And I think that's really important. Don't be scared to ask the stupid questions. It's, because what you're trying to do is find out what is your bottom line. And that's the most important thing. And again, we're going back to understanding cost and value. And I've got here, able to be nimble and adapt. And I think, again, that's that bringing commercial acumen to it, is saying, right, well, this isn't going well. What can I do to sort that out? What are the issues that I need to address here to keep my bottom line, not just to say, oh, well, it doesn't matter. The HRA will absorb this. It's not a big issue. It's only a few pence here. Treat every project as if it's your own money, and the bottom line is your own bottom line. And again, we're back to what skills are needed. It's understanding risk, which are commercial, and risks, which are reputational. One of the big issues that local authorities face is that you do have elected members who are accountable, and local stakeholders have a disproportionate influence on what you do because of that process, compared to the private sector or even HAs. So you need to know what that reputational damage is if things go wrong, or if you make unpopular decisions that affect your bottom line. And so sometimes being commercial is about thinking about the reputational costs against the need to drive that bottom line. And sometimes it will be that reputation is more important, and sometimes it will be taking a hard decision and being unpopular and facing flack. And that's when you need the support of senior teams, and you also need the support of members. So if you're going to make those sorts of decisions, is making sure that you have that support in place. I think, again, that's very, very key to that process. And that's being commercial, is making sure that the decisions that you are making, if they're unpopular, will still translate through. And I think over long terms, often, what feel like very controversial decisions that are incredibly unpopular, over time dissipate. So I think of an example where I built a 20-story development, and I had lots of people very, very upset that this would ruin their lives and all their views would be ruined, and it would be the worst thing ever. And I had a planning application with over 2,000 people wrote in complaining, saying they didn't want it. We had open meetings, lots of people being verbally very aggressive to me. Had local councillors being the same, even managed to get the local MP having a pop at me. But we got planning, and we built it. And just by chance, I then managed to meet some of those people who were quite vociferous. And lots of them were just saying, yes, yeah, actually, it hasn't impacted my life at all, actually. We overstated it. So often those things do dissipate. So, stick to your guns if you think you're right. Next slide, please. Right, areas to review. And what local authority session would be complete without a comment on procurement? And I think this is one of the key things about being commercial, and I'm sure all of you are saying stops us being commercial, is the procurement process, because it's quite hard to navigate. And if it's going to be hard, give yourself enough time to do that. Make sure you understand the procurement process, but also talk to your procurement teams and find out what is really law and what is custom and practice. So I had a local authority client, and we were going to do some sketch proposals for infill hidden homes. I went and got a load of frameworks, different architects off these different frameworks to do different schemes. I was able to set that up in a couple of weeks, and we were ready to go. The person in charge of procurement wasn't that happy about using different frameworks. I was only in a couple of days a week. I came down a week later, and all of that had been thrown away, and we were just going to use one framework and do a full tender process, which set everything back 6 months. And then that wasn't legally required. That was custom and practice. So that program was delayed by 6 months because the procurement manager didn't feel comfortable with something. But that wasn't, that was custom and practice. So if I'd have been there, I'd have probably argued that out. But unfortunately, I wasn't there for a week and it was done. So be clear what is law and what is custom and practice. And then if you are going to do it, put enough time in there. Do the checks and balances that you require. And if you're going to have a big program, I'm going to be building lots of homes, well, think about the frameworks that you can get onto and work with your procurement team to get onto those, or set up your own frameworks so that, over the next 4 or 5 years, you can draw on architects, EAs, consultants, structural engineers, whoever you need, because that will make your life easier, because you can make quicker decisions and you can get the right people for the right jobs. And I think that's something we're moving on to. The next thing is learn from housing associations. Housing associations have been doing what you're now doing for 30 years. That's kind of roughly how long I've been doing it. And they've made loads of mistakes because they've been learning. Now, you don't need to make those same mistakes. And I'm seeing local authorities making the same mistakes that housing associations have made. And you don't need to. Someone else has already made those for you. Go and talk to them. Get their expertise in. Because they have got a lot to give. And I know I've heard it from lots of local authorities, the design is poor, this is poor, that's poor. Yes, the design and build process isn't the best and all sorts of different things. And again, it depends what your drivers are. And the design and build process was set up to deliver against funding. So it's good at delivering on time and on cost if you're not changing your mind. But the development of it now with us, designing up to, I was going to say stage D of REBA, but that doesn't exist, does it? So what's it, 3.5? And Tom, Neil will tell me, is it 3.5 now? So 3.5, decided to 3.5, and then passing on gives us a much greater clarity on what the design is going to look like. And you can ensure that quality through using that process. And you can have design guardians as well, or novate your architect. There's loads of different ways of ensuring that. So, but HAs have learned that. Use that knowledge. Other areas to view: what scale are you working at? How big is your program? I hear lots of local authorities say, and these are probably members who have made these promises, we're going to build 1,000 homes in 4 years. No, you're not. You're just not going to. You're not going to be able to scale up in 4 years from 0 to deliver 1,000 homes. It's just not going to happen. You won't be able to get the skills into your development team because there aren't that many people around that you can get in. And even if you did, you haven't got the processes set up. And just even at a standing start, it's going to take too long. So be realistic about what your targets are in terms of scaling up to what, deliver 1,000 homes in 6 or 7 years. Yes, in 4 years, it's just not going to happen. Be realistic about those, about your scaling up, and then what that will mean. Is that 1,000 homes then stop, or are you got a 10-year program, and how many is that going to be? Think these things through and get the team right to deliver that. Because if you don't, you're just setting yourself up to fail. You're setting yourself up for more political pressure because promises have been made that can't be delivered. And then what happens? We start to fudge things. We start to cut corners. We start to do things which aren't in the best interest of the projects, because we're trying to chase political objectives rather than the commercial objectives. And I've seen lots of those examples. And that's, we're talking about learning from HAs. Are your consultant team the right fit for you? Do they have the experiences that you don't? Do they have the knowledge that you don't? Can they complement what you're doing? Can they complement what you're delivering? Make sure you get the right team in. Then I want to just quickly talk about brand. So if you are doing some cross subsidy and you're selling homes, what is all your branding? What is all your branding and how effective is it? It's incredibly important if you're going into the private sector to sell homes that you get your branding right. And don't leave it to the last minute. Do it early so that you can shape it. It's incredibly important, and it has a fantastic commercial advantage if you have the right branding. You only have to look to Berkeley Homes, who are the market leaders within London for developing, and they get a premium. So you look at, for example, down in Croydon, they're getting 7 to 10% more than everybody else for the homes they produce, because people like their brand. And it's the same all the way across London. And so that's how effective branding can be, because their brand is so strong. So be very clear about that. I then wanted to say a quick thing just about after sales and the service you give. All of that is really important around, to review about your commercial approach, because you will have people feeding back. We will live in a very digital, well, we live in a digital age, and information is freely available. Information is power. And if you're not providing that service afterwards, people will know. They'll know very, very quickly. So you need to make sure that the after sales service is really crucial. And my last point to an area to review is governance and monitoring and the progress and outcomes. And I wanted to throw that in for an area of review because, again, local authorities are under a lot more scrutiny than all the other organisations who are delivering homes. And that takes time and that takes resource. And so you need to be aware of that. And again, if you're trying to be commercial, you need to think about that. You need to think about what the implications of your governance structures and your monitoring are. If you're reporting to boards or you're reporting up to cabinet, that's usually quite a long process because there's quite a lot of scrutiny goes through that and lots of different departments want to see it. And then you've only got certain windows that you could hit because they only sit at certain times. And if you miss those, there's going to be implications for you. So, for you, being commercial means making sure you know your timetable and hitting those timetables. So I think there's quite a lot for us to debate within the workshops about what commercial means for local authorities. And it's a massive topic because you have so many different drivers and you have so many different structures that you need to work within. So it's one of the most complex areas to work with. And so the people doing it need to have those skill sets that can deal with that massive complexity. And that's my presentation. Thank you. Hopefully I was on, oh look, minute to go.
Thanks, Danny. That was great, and I really like that. I think you're speaking from experience, and the reality is, as you've said, this is very complex. I like the fact you've emphasised the asking questions. Asking questions is always really good. It's something we want to encourage. Your reference to procurement, where actually our next council-led housing forum is going to be looking at procurement. So yeah, a really critical part of being commercial is getting that process right and getting the right outcomes that actually meet your drivers. So yeah, and the realism around targets, which I think is something we've is driving a lot of business within local authorities. There's some really hard targets to meet right now. And there needs to be some realism. I've got a feeling that is something we might hear more of later during the session. I wondered before we move off whether you might just expand a bit on the approach to returns, because it's something that that perhaps isn't as discussed in local authorities, I think, maybe as it is, it's almost a private sector term. But thinking about returns, I mean, you did give a very good example with the Goldsmith Street and the potential to make a return. And you've mentioned Croydon and the fact that they get a premium on their sales, and that's a return. Do you have any views about the best way to structure an approach to measuring returns?
Yes, I mean, I think it's incredibly important that all schemes are appraised financially. So you can do a discounted cash flow, you can use net present value, you can use internal rates of return, you can use cost of value. I don't think it matters what the approach is, as long as you have one. So all schemes should be financially appraised individually and then set within a larger program cash flow, so that each scheme then performs on its own, and you can measure that and measure what the returns on those are. And you do that by setting your own internal hurdles. So if it's net present value, generally it's got to be positive. If it's internal rate of returns, then you're looking with the borrowing levels that local authorities got, it might be 4 or 5%. Or cost of value, well, you can do a big piece around that, because obviously you should never be more than 100%, because you can just go out and buy something off the shelf if it's 100%. And it should be quite a lot lower, because most of the time you've got free land. So you need to look at where that cost of value needs to sit. And then you look at overall about the programme. Now, I know I've seen local authorities who've just been building within the HRA and haven't had that project scrutiny, because they're just saying, well, we're going to spend X and that's within the HRA cap and we've got the ability to borrow. And I think if you're going to do a bigger, if you're going to do 1 or 2 homes, that's fine. But if you're going to do a bigger program, each scheme needs to work. And so each scheme needs to be financially modelled. And I think most local authorities are doing that now, slowly but surely. And some of them didn't start off doing it and are catching up. And that catching up is often quite difficult. But yes, I think there's lots of good models out there that you can use to do discounted cash flows over 30, 40, even 60 years. There's PanWin, there's ProVal, there's PodPlan, there's my favorite, which I always recommend, which is Optimix. There's lots of different ways of looking at it. And then if you're looking at your private sale as well, you'll be tagging on something like Argus, which is what the private sector use, which is a very, very straightforward in and out program for gauging financial returns. And generally the public sector are looking at 20% for their return, which is not 20% on cash, it's for the end of the project. And so you need to have those clear financial drivers when you're looking at all your schemes. Now, there may be some tolerances around that, and you need to have some contingency, but you need to be setting those for every project.
Thanks, Danny. Yeah, and I think that chimes as well with obviously investing in the back room, which was one of the things you brought up. Having all the tools available, and this is something that I know we know through the council-led housing forum that local authorities are doing. But as you say, it's something that housing associations have gone through a huge learning curve. They've made some of the mistakes, and what we hope is that through council-led housing forum we can shortcut some of that and hopefully help spread some of the good practice. So I'm going to just at this point pause. I'm going to pause and say goodbye to our YouTube audience. If you're listening to this on YouTube, thank you for joining us on the YouTube. Do please look at other of our events through council-led housing forum that are also available on the channel, and look out for our live events and come and join us live too.